Hello and welcome to the Future of Work podcast by Allwork.Space. My name is Ceci Amalor de San Jose, and today I'm looking forward to chatting with Erica Keswin, best-selling author, internationally sought-after speaker, and founder of the Spaghetti Project, a roving ritual devoted to sharing the science and stories of relationships at work. She is the author of two best-selling books, Bring Your Human to Work, 10 Surefire Ways to Design a Workplace That's Good for People, Great for Business, and Just Might Change the World, and Rituals Roadmap, the human way to transform everyday routines into workplace magic. Erica, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And before we get started, I want to thank Office R&D, our sponsor for today's podcast. Office R&D is an amazing management platform that can help flexible workspace operators free up valuable time by automating administrative tasks and helping them make data-driven decisions so that they can spend more time focusing on growing their brand and engaging with their community. Today, thousands of flexible workspace operators are reaping the benefits. You should too. You can learn more about them at officernd.com and book your demo for free. So, Erica, I was reading your book up until earlier today, and I have to say that the introduction, when you mention our goal of the zero mail inbox, I identified with that. I cannot see the notifications, things on my phone, on my email, anything. It drives me nuts. Um, and I think that throughout your book, bringing your human to work, you actually like hit the nail right in the head with saying how yes, technology can do all of these amazing things for the workplace, for businesses, but it can also kind of hurt us a little bit. So I want to start out by having you talk to us a little bit about how did the idea of bringing your human to work come to mind for you? What did you experience it firsthand? Did you see how difficult it is for people to actually be present at work? And what were some of the impacts that you observed?
Yeah. So, one, I'm a workplace strategist, so I tend to watch for these things in the workplace. But one of the things I kept noticing was that people would be in the office. This was all before the pandemic, but they would be in the office with their colleagues and they would be sitting by themselves, alone together. And they would call into meetings from down the hall. The boss would say, come on, let's, we're going to come together with our team in my office. And I kept hearing the story over and over where some of the people would say, you know what, I'm just going to call in from my office. And I couldn't really understand it because being, working in this world, this space for 25 years, you learn so much when you're in person with someone, reading their body language and putting the client on mute and, having a boss mentor you in person. Now, obviously, much of that has changed in the midst of this pandemic, but I wrote this book in 2018. So, that really was the motivation to say that, how do we find what I call the sweet spot between tech and connect? How do we leverage technology for all of its greatness? But then how do we also put technology in its place and connect face to face? And I think, as we go into 2022, we're at another interesting fork in the road where we need to think about these hybrid workplaces and how do we leverage technology again to keep us connected when we're remote. But I've been doing a lot of work and thinking and consulting around when we do come together, we can't just show up. Like, we have to be very intentional about how we design the days and the hours that we do spend together to get the most out of it. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. So yeah, what you bring up a very interesting and very important point, which is that the return to the office will have to be very, very intentional for companies, especially those that will adopt a hybrid work model where workers can choose when and how they come into the office. I heard someone say that what's the point of going into the office if you're going to be the only person there? And so companies will need to figure out a way to leverage technology to make sure that when people do come in, they can actually connect with one another and not through technology. And I think your book brings out a lot of the topics that even back in 2018 companies were struggling with, but right now because of the pandemic, I think it's just made it even harder and more critical for them to address these types of issues. And I love the example that you gave about JetBlue and their onboarding and how they walk the talk. And they're like, okay, yeah, just bring yourself to work, and they were very authentic from the examples that you gave. But this was in an in-person setting, and one of the things that have changed as a result is that a lot of people are being onboarded virtually. How can companies make sure that through that onboarding process virtually that they still bring out the human in them? Because the way I see, and this has a lot to do with meetings and tech, but it's like you said, body language, tone, very like kind of like subtle cues about the expressions and stuff like that. It can be easily missed, especially if I'm imagining this is how it kind of goes. You have like a presentation that they're giving, and then you have them looking at the camera, but then they can't really see everyone in their screen if they're sharing a presentation that they're giving. So, how does the experience, the onboarding experience, become kind of more challenging? And how can recruiters and managers and leaders bring that human touch to virtual settings?
Yes, I mean, similar, it goes back to being intentional. So I think the onboarding process starts not even on the first day, but well before the first day. And so, again, whether you're talking about in person onboarding or remote onboarding, give that person a buddy, somebody that reaches out to welcomes you into the organization, answers any questions. Oftentimes, it's great if it's not a manager, make it someone who's more like a peer. And now when we're doing this virtually, that first day is even that much more important. So what happens? It's I start on November 29th, on Monday after Thanksgiving, and what do I do? Do I just turn on my computer? No. I mean, if you're on Zoom, your manager needs to meet with you. The day needs to be very curated, in terms of check-ins, in terms of what's expected. One way to think about onboarding, I talk a lot in the book about values. Companies often have values, and sadly, many of the companies just have values that are sitting on a plaque. They're on the walls. The key is, how do you get them off the walls and into the halls and bring them to life? And the onboarding process is one way to do that. So if you recruit somebody and you bring them into your company and you're all about collaboration and you're all about excellence, through this onboarding process, you need to show what that looks like, what that means. And so that could be through storytelling. It could be through using a Slack channel. It could be through showing people that you're going to get put on a bunch of different projects and how people are expected to collaborate. And so doing it through the lens of the values is really important. I also think that, especially being remote, that somebody should be checking in with this person, I would say at least once or twice a day, every day for the first month that this person's there. We can't hear you.
How do you, and I think that's great, and I think that can definitely bring that human connection and that human touch, but how do you prevent those regular checkings from becoming a distraction? And that's something that you also mentioned in your book. We have all of these collaboration tools, and you have email and Slack and different messaging apps, but they can become kind of like a distraction where meaningful connections don't really take place anymore. So tell a little bit about these check-ins. How should they look? Is it just like a quick, hey, everything good? Do you have any questions? Or like you said, should they be more intentional? So specific questions. I feel, and this is from my early days, when I first started a new job, like I didn't necessarily know what I needed help with. Sort of like when they tell you that whenever you tell someone, yeah, let me know if you need anything. It's hard for people to know exactly at times what they need, especially if they're under stress or it's a new situation. So, what do these check-ins should look like in your experience? What makes them work?
Well, when we're talking about currently during this remote time, The last 18 months have really turned everything on its head. And so what I have found is that in the beginning of the pandemic, 60 minutes of a 60-minute meeting were spent checking in. 6 months into the pandemic, 30 minutes of a 30-minute meeting were spent checking in. And now I get the question all the time, do I need to keep checking in? And the answer is yes. I mean, we're not through this, and people are still, the numbers even as of today are much higher than we thought that they would be. So it's really important to keep checking in, but we also need to get work done. And so a couple of ideas for leaders, and I think about this through the lens of rituals, which is I cover in my second book, Rituals Roadmap. Start off a meeting and have everybody go around the Zoom, or if you're in person, and share one word that describes how you're showing up. And what that does, it's inclusive. Everybody participates. If you have introverts on your team, let them know ahead of time it's going to happen. They can think about what their word is going to be. It brings out some interesting themes. If you're a manager and everybody's word is, I'm great, things couldn't be better. And that happens week after week. Perhaps you don't have the kind of culture where people can be open and honest, because it's, not often that all 10 people in your meeting every week, that things are perfect. If somebody does share a word that indicates that, things are a bit crazy at home that day, one, it gives you an opportunity to have a deeper check-in with that person and have a one-on-one. It also gives the team an opportunity to step in and, be supportive and provide, extra help. So I think that is a way, and try to bring that into a ritual into your meeting. Alternatively, I would say you can actually do both of these things. Sometimes, to your point, when you say, so how are you doing? Some people don't know how to answer that, or it doesn't seem that you actually really care or want to know the answer. So recently I was listening to a podcast with the head of HR from Dropbox, who said that in their leadership development training, managers are asked to start their check-ins by saying, how are you really, really doing? And I think just shifting that and pausing, gives the listener, wow, like they really want to know how I'm doing. And I think it's really important right now, especially end of 21, beginning of 22, in the midst of this great resignation. People are leaving jobs, and the ones that stay feel connected. And so the checking in is really important, probably even more than it was before.
Yes, I agree that with the Great Resignation and the skyrocketing numbers of people quitting, it's that feeling of connection with a company, with leaders, with coworkers. It's definitely key to helping, or at least to stave off a little bit of that itch that a lot of people have to just move towards something new. And then you were talking about rituals, and like you said, you have another book that's completely dedicated to that. What are some other rituals that you believe can improve workplace dynamics, especially in hybrid environments?
So, it depends on the company, but when I started to interview hundreds of people about their rituals at work, sometimes people weren't even sure what the rituals are. And so I came up with a question that when I asked leaders the question, all of a sudden they would have that light bulb moment and say, oh, wow, that's our ritual. So I'll share with your listeners the magic question. I asked this, for example, to Marisa Andrada, who's the head of HR at Chipotle, and I asked executives at LinkedIn and all different kinds of companies. And the question is, when do associates or when do employees feel most Chipotle-ish, most part of the culture? And when I asked that question, Marisa was able to say, one of our really important rituals is every day before we open the doors at Chipotle at 10:30 a.m., every day at 10:15, all of the people that have come in the morning to chop up the lettuce and make the guacamole, they all sit around the table and have a meal together, and it makes them feel connected. They take a deep breath before the doors open. And there's actually a study out of Cornell that found that the firefighters, for example, who are the most dedicated to the ritual of the firehouse meal, it actually correlates with higher levels of performance, and those firefighters save more lives. And so, there are even some companies that have been eating together over Zoom. So a lot of the rituals, whether it's hybrid or in person, you start by thinking about those as it relates to that, to answering that question. And the themes that popped up, there were rituals around onboarding, rituals in the beginning of meetings. At Eileen Fisher, they ring a gong before the meeting just to have everybody sort of settle. At some of the Toyota, somebody shares a story that's related to their value around safety. And so it's just these moments that really connect people. There was a group of companies that said, you know what, we feel most connected to our company during our annual celebration, when we all come together to celebrate a win or to celebrate what we've done at the end of the year. So when you think about the employee experience, the examples and the opportunities for rituals really are in all of those different places.
Have you ever come across companies that don't have rituals, or I mean, they do, but they're not fully in place, so they're not consistent? Because that's part of an important key of having rituals work is that they have to be consistent. They have to be very much part of our routine. Otherwise,
Mhm.
if it fluctuates, it doesn't work. So, in your work, have you come across companies that either have a hard time identifying those rituals or that they're not so consistent? And if so, what are some ways that leaders and managers can make sure to bring that ritual part of it to work on a regular basis?
Yeah. So a couple of things there. I mean, rituals can come from anywhere. They can come from the top down, the bottom up, the inside out. And, rituals are more of a pull versus a push. You can't really mandate a ritual. You must do this. Just by definition, that sort of makes it not a ritual. So the first thing I would say is that, for leaders listening, if you try to start something or if you have a ritual and it's just really not catching on after you try, I think we need to take our ego out of it and move on, because there are other rituals that will sort of have that stickiness, but this one in particular, for whatever reason, just hasn't caught on. You can ask for input from your team and say, here's the science of rituals. Here's why rituals are so important. What do you think we could do for a ritual for our team? I've also seen leaders that once we've talked about the definition of a ritual and the ROI of a ritual, and I asked them that question, when do employees feel most connected? They realized that they had them, but they didn't necessarily call them rituals. They were just things that they did. And it's a ritual if it goes away and people kind of go crazy. They think, oh my gosh, what happened? Or they think the company's being sold and they really miss it when they're gone. And so I think it's all of those things. One quick story that I'll share, just to show that you can create a ritual and have it stick. In the book, I interview a guy named Morty Shapiro, who's the president of Northwestern University. And he came from Williams College, a university that's like steeped in rituals. They had so many rituals. And he got to Northwestern and he said to his team, okay, everybody, what are our rituals? Here, our new rituals at my new school. And people looked at him like he was nuts. And he was like, wow, this is really important. We need to have some rituals. So there was a big arch on campus. And so he said, you know what, why don't we, on the first day of school, of a 4-year college experience, the very first day of your journey, let's have all the students walk through the arch, and let's try that as a way. Again, rituals bring us together and give us that feeling of connection, and your oxytocin goes up and your stress goes down. And again, there's a lot of science behind the health benefits and the business benefits and all of that. And so the first year, he probably had about 50 kids walk through the arch, and he had forgotten to tell the local police to shut the streets down, and the kids were running in and out of the streets. The second year, about 250 kids walked through the arch. The third year, they had all 2,000 people, all the kids walking through the arch, and now it is literally a ritual that you would never miss. Even the parents stay, and I now have friends whose kids go and they take pictures, and it's an unbelievable thing. And Morty shared with me a story where he spoke to a junior that was about to be a senior, and he says to the kid, so you're about to be a senior, what has been one of the most memorable moments in your almost 4 years here at Northwestern? And the kid said, Dr. Shapiro, it was March through the arch, because it felt so good to be connected to all of those people that had come before me. And Morty then says, with a wink in his eye, I didn't have the heart to tell the poor kid it was only the third year. And so that's the magic of rituals, that when they stick and they're connected to the values and they really bring people together in the culture of your organization, there's just a magic to it.
I have to agree. I While you were telling the story, I was trying to think of a ritual in my school, and there's definitely some that stand out. But those are a story for another day. Erica, and then one of the things that I really liked about your book, and you mentioned this very early on in the first chapter, is the importance of honoring relationships. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit about what honoring relationships is. What does it look like, and why in a workplace setting that's so important?
So people would often ask me after Bring Your Human to Work came out, they would say, well, what does it mean to bring your human to work? Like, do you really want me to bring my whole everything human to work? There is a caveat. This is work and it is a professional place. So I always say, bring your best human to work, your most professional human to work. But they still weren't sure what that meant. So if I were to boil it down to one sentence, it really is about honoring relationships and honoring relationships with your colleagues, with your boss, with your direct reports, with your clients and customers, and also honoring the relationship with yourself. It really is all of those things. And there's a litmus test when you're looking to make a decision. Do you hire this person? Do you do a new deal? Different things that you might change in your company. I often think about those decisions through this lens of thinking about all of those relationships and the impact on all of those relationships. And I think when we can keep that top of mind, it does end up creating a much more human workplace.
I agree, and there's something. Okay, and this is I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe a little. And this is something that came up in the meeting today earlier. We were talking about, with remote work and hybrid teams, how do you ensure, because the way people honor relationships across the globe is very, very different from culture to
Mm-hmm.
culture. So with companies that are very distributed, that have an international team of people, how do you make sure that the way that people honor relationships is something that can cross borders, to put it in one way? So, for example, the way people honor relationships in Guatemala may be different than they do in Germany, in the US, in Canada, in
Yep.
Asia. So, how can you make sure that there are no conflicts that could arise from the way that people array yeah, that people kind of like honor relationships? How can you set the tone, and who sets that tone of how to honor relationships at work?
And look, there may be conflicts, and that's part of having a global organization and having these conversations. But if a company has a set of values that truly represent, the soul and the essence of the behaviors that are expected in an organization, I look at everything through that lens. Some companies end up having way too many values. That's a problem with many companies. If you have 10, 12, 14 values, it's not going to drive any kinds of behavior. If my sweet spot is sort of 3 to 6 values. If that's what we stand for as a company, if those are the behaviors, it's the how, right? The mission and the strategy is the what. The values are the how we are going to get things done. And yes, there might be differences in terms of the way that we approach things, but if we have similar values personally and also the values that we stand for at work, you're going to get much closer. And if that's the starting point, then it's really up to the leader to set those expectations and to think about it across his or her, different geographies, and to have conversations about what living that value might look like in the US versus in Guatemala versus in Mexico City. And bring that to life and have those conversations. I mean, honoring relationships is a big piece of it, is being able to have those conversations, and doing it through the lens of the values provides the structure within which you can have those conversations.
And then you mentioned, you mentioned that conflict is to be expected in global organizations. I feel like conflict, I mean, it has to be expected basically everywhere. I feel like when
Yes.
you don't, I think that sometimes the best innovations and ideas come out of conflict resolutions. Um, But in a hybrid setting, again, everything it's different. The way people interact, the way they talk to each other. How can companies improve conflict management for hybrid work settings? And I think I've told this example several times on the podcast, but I once had a complaint made about me that I was too short and on messages. So people would say, "Hey, Ceci, uh, is this okay? Yes, no, okay." And they're like, "Well, she's not nice, she's mean." And I'm like, I'm not mean, but you don't you haven't met me. This was before the pandemic, so Zoom with video calls, I mean, they were often, but sometimes people didn't put the video. And so I had my manager be like, is there a way that you could maybe try to be nicer via chat? And then I found myself excessively using emojis. But it sort of it helped. It helped, like, yes, thumbs up, happy face. But in a hybrid setting, going back to conflict and these types of issues that may arise, how can leaders manage that conflict in a way that's healthy and that provides that kind of like same space for all parties involved to voice whatever they need to
Hmm.
voice?
So you can't leave it to chance. I'll send it to you when it's ready. You can share it out to your listeners. But I have an article coming about the top 10 ways to have a successful hybrid meeting, and
Oh, nice.
it's you have to begin with intention. You have to end with intention. You have to have rules of the road. So just a couple that off the top of my head. I mean, let's say you have 4 people in the office and 6 people at home. Perhaps once every other week, everybody calls in. Even if you're co-located, everybody calls in with their own link to democratize the experience. I mean, during the pandemic, that was one of the things that people talked about as being a positive, that all of a sudden everybody was sort of on this equal playing field. And now, as we go back into the office, it's going to be challenging. I spoke with the CEO yesterday who said one of the things that they do is when they're having, when they put something out and they ask a question and they want responses, they are very, very intentional. First, somebody that's remote gets called on to give, his or her idea. Then someone's in person, and you keep alternating back and forth. And you do that throughout the meeting. You tell everybody to really be polite and mind their manners, that the people in the office, and someone has to orchestrate this and manage it and run it, because the last thing you want is the 4 people that are in the room together, having side conversations and, making the people that are remote just feel really bad. And that is not what you want. Again, we're in the midst of this great resignation, and this will, I guarantee, cause people to leave. And so
Yeah.
you want to begin on time. You want to end on time. You want to make sure, for example, that when the meeting ends, it ends, and that the 4 people that are in the room together, you need to tell them it is important that you don't keep talking about the topic because only 40% of the people are there. And that again goes back to your question about honoring relationships. If you're thinking about through that lens, you're going to realize that feels crappy if you're at home when the 4 people in the office are continuing the meeting when you're not there. And so it's having a plan, having these rules of the road. It's being flexible, knowing that the rules might change, and then thinking about it again through the values, which I know seems, some people will say, oh, that's so touchy-feely and sort of squishy. But I would push back and say sometimes, especially now, this soft stuff is really the hard stuff. And it is so, so important right now.
I agree in what you just said about, and this had not even crossed my mind that, yeah, like if everyone's in this participating in this meeting, whether you were in person with others or not, like the meeting needs to stop at the same time for everyone. And like you said, you don't want people to have side conversations during the meeting. And I don't know if this happened to you, but I remember when the pandemic first hit, everyone was doing kind of like Zoom family and friends events. And I had a few, and I could always see that when like the big families, or if like a few people lived close by, they would get together, and so they would be together, but then they would be talking about stuff between them. And I ended up hating these types of meetings.
Yes.
I decided never to join anyone anymore. I'm like, yeah, we're gonna have like a friends drinks night on Zoom. I'm like, yeah, no, I'll meet you whenever we can go out and have drinks in person
Well,
because
but
it was not a nice
that's a
experience.
great example, because if somebody had been orchestrating that and having rules of the road to
Yeah,
participate so that everybody feels good, maybe you have, maybe the first one, they bring in, a mixologist, and everybody makes a drink together, and everybody goes around and says something, and it's inclusive versus your experience with it. And so that's the risk of these hybrid meetings not working. That I have a podcast also, which is called Left to Our Own Devices. And I called it that because left to our own devices, excusing the cheesy pun, we're not connecting. And so if you have a hybrid meeting without thinking through how it works, when it starts, when it ends, the technology, icebreakers, checking in, all of these things, and then your goals, um, it's going to be a free for all, and people will leave feeling less connected than ever before.
yeah, I agree. And we're almost running out of time here, Erica. So, off the top of your head, what are the, I don't want to say top, but what are some 5 ways that people can bring their human to work tomorrow?
Wow. Okay. Um, I would say number one, be real and speak in a human voice. And what I mean by that is, if the more open and even vulnerable you can be, you will get everybody else to open up as well, especially if you are a leader or a manager, that your goal is, a lot of times people think that the manager has it all figured out. So be real, speak in a human voice. I'd say that is number one. Number two, these days, mental health is really an issue. Things are unprecedented in terms of stress. So the second way to bring your human to work is create a culture of wellness. And that could be through a ritual of people taking deep breaths, or a manager could say, okay, every Wednesday, Wellness Wednesday, we're going to have an hour from 1 to 2 to just turn everything off, and then report back on taking care of yourself, and spending a little time kind of putting your own oxygen mask on first. So I would say those are two. Um, Meetings is a third one. Is that bringing your human to work these days is thinking through what we just spoke about with meetings. I'd say number four is returning to rituals or creating new ones, and really thinking about the way that, especially in a hybrid environment, that even just a quick ritual of going around and sharing a word with people, how that really can be that connective tissue and that stickiness. And I'd say the last, and certainly not least, and especially as we're taping this right before Thanksgiving, is to say thanks and to have gratitude. And that's another thing that makes a big difference at work. People want to hear thanks, and the research shows that the person giving the thanks gets just as much out of it as the person receiving it.
I love all of those. On the last one that you mentioned, I feel like gratitude has become a very important talking point. I don't know if this was a result of the pandemic or because of the pandemic, people started to talk about it more. But I've seen so many leaders talk about the power of gratitude at work, and how just saying thank you for the work you did or the work you're doing has this like immense power to make people feel happier and more connected at work.
Yeah.
Um, so thank you, Rika. And if people wanted to learn more about you, where can they go? Where can they find out more about you, your books, the work that you do?
Great. They can find me on my website, was just my name, ericakeswin.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. They can find me on my Instagram, which is just my name. And it talks about what I do, the keynote talks and the workshops around how to bring your human to work and how to bring rituals into the workplace. And would love to hear from your listeners.
Awesome. So there you have it, everyone. You know where to find Erica. Thank you again to our sponsor, Office R&D. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the Future of Work podcast by Allwork.Space. Remember that you can tune in on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. New episodes are released every Thursday.